Okay, so you are such an incredible scholar and have dedicated your life. I'd love to hear how you frame it to what would you say? What have you dedicated your life to?
Well, the broad answer is sort of the mystery of spirit and human incarnation. The specifics are afterlife and the journey of the soul and accompanying people through the valley of the shadow of death towards acceptance of death and healing, among other things.
Nice, light, fluffy topics.
Right.
My favorite topic. So, where are you? Give us a little bit of like context for what you've been studying and teaching and why. And just for people who haven't read your books yet, but who will after this, get a little taste of your journey.
Okay. Um, I had I had a background in Jewish studies and world religions in university, and I felt like most of my professors hadn't dealt with their crisis of faith. So while I always loved academic study of world religions, I felt I wanted something more functional than just academic study of religion. And I ended up at a place called, that wasn't called that then, but became the California Institute of Integral Studies, which was a spiritually oriented training program for therapists. So I went from a master's degree in religious studies to being able to go into a doctoral program in psychology with only a background in religious studies, because you could do that in California in the late 70s.
Mhm.
And it's a longer story, but I ended up doing my research on life after death in Judaism with applications for working with the dying and bereaved. I had had a number of experiences of people I loved dying and feeling a sense of their presence after their death. And I couldn't find in Jewish tradition anything about life after death. So, in essence, I wrote the book I would have wanted to read when my closest friend was killed in a car accident. So, that's sort of a little bit about my training. um, I reworked my doctoral dissertation was called Judaism's Contribution to the Psychology of Death and the Afterlife, which sounded very prim and proper academic, but it was on life after death and survival of consciousness after death with applications for working with the dying and bereaved. And again, only in California, at that point it was in the mid 80s, could I get away with that kind of dissertation. And one of my dissertation advisors had been one of the three people doing the original psychedelic research. There was Timothy Leary and Baba Ramdas, but the third guy was Ralph Metzner, and Ralph Metzner and Reb Zalman and another person were my dissertation advisors. So only retroactively have I realized that I had some very special teachers to guide me in this project.
Hmm.
After I graduated, my first job was as resident psychologist in a Jewish funeral home. So I had read a lot of books. I was a smart guy, and all of a sudden I was dealing with people who were dealing with suicide and SIDS and violent death. And along the way, I learned to integrate the philosophy and spirituality of life after death with practice of companioning people through dealing with death and grief and loss. And so I've done that in various different ways over the years, um, largely but not exclusively in a Jewish context.
Mhm.
Um, I've written on afterlife in Judaism, but I'm familiar with the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Eastern religions and death and reincarnation teachings, and I still have that world religions background.
Okay, so before this whole study and teaching and sharing and working with people, where were you philosophically? Like as a young person, as a teen, as a young adult, where were you about afterlife? What were you thinking about God and spirit? Was that always part of were you able to just swallow all of that as truth? Like I'm curious about where you sort of began and then where you are now with all of these things that we can't actually that are not tangible but are present.
Well, when I was 4 and my grandmother died, they told me she went to heaven. And I was this dreamy little kid. So I spent the next, I don't know, 5 to 8 years talking to her every night in heaven. So I was definitely aware as a child that I felt a sense of connection with the spirit of someone who had died. And in fact, I mean, so that was even before my closest friend was killed in a car accident. That was a very early kind of experience. And in fact, in retrospect, I realized that everything I learned later reading books, in some ways I had been taught by my grandmother as a very young child. And I think I was permeable to the interconnection between invisible worlds. I think that was
Mm-hmm.
something I didn't cognitively know at the time, but when I look back upon that period of my life, that's how um, I understand that. So religion, spirituality was another learning later on. I was of the vintage where Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and Mia Farrow were meditating with the Beatles. And so in the early 70s, when that stuff came into vogue, I was already in a religion department and I was studying Hinduism and Buddhism and comparative religious philosophies and religious history of Western civilization. I mean, those are some of the even undergraduate courses I had taken. And in graduate school, I had a fellowship studying, it was, quote, a psychosocial study of new religious and para-religious movements in the greater Montreal area. I was paid to go do participant observation research on meditation and yoga and interview people. And so that was in my early 20s. I was part of that movement. I had a free trip to India in between my first and second year of graduate school. There was an organization called the Shasta Indo-Canadian Institute. It funded Indian studies in Canada and Canadians doing research in India. And one summer, I was one of 50 students in an all India cultural program at a Canadian university. The next year, they took 18 of us, and we had a clockwise tour for 6 weeks all around India. I got to meet Mrs. Gandhi and the president of India, and then we spent the 7th week on a houseboat in Kashmir. And then I went to visit the Tibetan Buddhist refugee village in McLeod Ganj. So that was transformational in that I realized that I needed to go back and reclaim my Jewish learning.
Yeah.
And so that, like there's different pieces of the weave. Yeah. So that your question was, how did that fit in with, studying afterlife, how did that fit in my early beliefs? There wasn't such a stretch because I guess I was permeable as a young child. I was studying religions as a young adult, and I had those experiences with connection with people who died, both as a child and then in my early 20s. And so I deepened that through my academic learning and then through my teaching. But I guess
what
those
about embodied practice? What about your connection or the way that you're working with other realms? Is there anything that's part of your kind of daily or has been over your long amazing career?
Well, my embodied practice is I try to go to the gym every day, and I never did that before in my life. As I get close to 70, I figured it's about time to do that. My sense is that between this world and the world beyond is a window and not a wall. Between this world and the world beyond is a window and not a wall. And in moments of meditative practice and dreams and synchronicities, that window opens. So I feel like I'm perpetually in touch with the edge of that realm. I don't claim to be psychic.
Okay.
But last Saturday, I had a conversation in my mind, just sort of popped up with an uncle of mine with whom I have some incomplete stuff. And then I found out like 2 days later that he died.
Mhm.
So like, it wasn't like, oh, let me tune in to see how Uncle Leo is doing. It was more like Uncle Leo popped into my mind, and yeah, that makes sense. And I could feel some sense of connection and continuing conversation with him. Um, so I'm not sure exactly what you mean by
How do you
embodied
explain
practice.
that? What do you
What?
think that, how do you explain that? How do you
Between this world and the world beyond is a window and not a wall. I don't feel I have to rationalize it because I never bought into the materialistic model. When we did the doctoral work together, we meaning my colleagues, my co-students, we were aware that we were being educated on the other side of the rationalist paradigm.
Mhm.
There was a book that was very much in vogue for a while called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And it talked about, that was the first book to talk about paradigm shift.
Mhm.
So I remember reading in my early 20s about a paradigm shift. And I was aware that in my own thinking, I was moving beyond the scientific Western materialistic paradigm that says consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain, and when the brain stops firing, when the neurons stop firing, dead is dead. That wasn't the paradigm that I have lived in for the last 40 years of my life. So I understand the intellectual limitations of that paradigm, but intellectually, personally, experientially, I have not lived in that paradigm. So I remember somebody came to me a number of years ago and said, I would like you to teach a course on religion and psychology. And I said, I do not want to teach the course on the rational side of the paradigm. I don't
Mhm.
want to teach the 19th century sociologists of religion who were skeptical about religious experience. I want to teach on the other side of the paradigm. So I'm willing to talk about Freud insofar as he was seminal in that, but I also want to talk about Jung and Maslow and Roberto Assagioli, who was a later contemporary of Freud, who talked about psychosynthesis and the integration of spirit and psyche. I want to talk about transpersonal psychology, Ken Wilber, Gene Houston. And that was over 30 years ago that I just said I'm not I won't I'll give deference to that paradigm, but I want to teach on the other side of it. So I don't feel like I have to be, I'm not apologetic.
Yeah.
Now, when I go in and teach about Jewish views of the afterlife, I go into a middle of the road conservative congregation, Beth Suburbia, where
Mhm.
there's always a big fat guy sitting in the front row with a big fat ring, giving me this dirty look, like I don't believe in any of that afterlife shit. Now let's talk about it. And to him, I say, and I say this when I teach, I am not selling belief, because if I say believe and you say I
Right.
don't believe,
Right.
we're in an adversarial relationship. I say, tongue in cheek, I will sell you my book, mind you, but I'm not selling belief, right? So that already lightens the scene. And then I say, but at least I want you to see what our Jewish tradition has to say about life after death. And in that sense, I sort of stand behind
Mhm.
the role of scholar and say, okay, here's what the tradition says. This is the way I try to understand it. But ultimately, everybody has to do their own meaning making around dying and death. But at least I want people to have a kind of cognitive spiritual worldview
Mhm.
that allows them to see that there's more than simply the belief that dead is dead and what lives on are the good deeds, or
Yeah.
we don't believe in afterlife and stuff like that, which is what I encounter a lot of the time.
And in terms of like how you talk about or teach soul or spirit,
Funny
is
you should
there
ask that question.
is there a difference? Personally, not
Okay.
from your, and or if there's one of your books that you love how you were able to think through it or process it, then name that. Absolutely, since we didn't like prep before or anything like that. And I just wanted this to be really, I really want people who feel interested in these questions and topics to dive into your work. You've got lots of YouTube stuff, and obviously prolific books and writing, but I'm just curious about your personal, how you see it.
Okay.
And if that's
Let me say something. I want to say something about God.
Yeah.
My theology is we are interwoven into the fabric of the universe.
Okay.
God is not a big guy in the sky with a white beard who stands upon the mountain and with a booming voice.
Thank goddess.
But thank God. Right. So I studied with Starhawk for along the way. Also, she taught me everything a rabbi in training needs to know about the goddess.
Yeah.
So I'm more of a pantheist in the sense that it is all spirit and we are interwoven. So synchronicities and meaningful coincidences and connections with people and looking at the trees and feeling, I'm looking out my window now and seeing the trees blowing in the wind and knowing that every single leaf on that tree has the exact destined moment that it'll be falling down off that tree and come September or October or as late as November. Some of them live that long, right? So all of that is my sense of God, spirit, universe, and we are all interwoven into the fabric of life. That being said, we are also individuals. My teacher, Reb Zalman, used to talk about the universe. It's all one and there's diversity. So people say, what does soul mean? So in the Kabbalistic model, we are an amalgam of interwoven layers of psyche, spirit, material. So let me give you a visual on that. The host has disabled screen sharing, so now you need to enable it for me.
There you go.
Okay, so now I can do that. So soul is not a simple little angelic bubble floating off like on a Hallmark card. We are body, emotion, mind, spirit, cosmos. Right? So people can check this out, right? I'm sitting in my physical body, or the pranic body, if you know yoga, is the energetic field that surrounds and interpenetrates the physical body, right? The emotional energy field surrounds and interpenetrates the physical body. Mind, not just cognitive mind, but the higher mind that perceives wholes. It says, oh wow, you look at a picture of the cosmos from the Hubble telescope and you say, oh wow, that's that's still mind function, but it's the mind that perceives whole. And then there's a place where we plug into the universe. People call that God, and ultimately we are part of the whole cosmos. So in Kabbalah, there are very specific terms for this: nefesh, ruach, chaya, yechida, nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida. But this is sort of the model that here I am in my individuality. This is my simcha-ness. I am the child of these parents at this period of time, and this is my DNA structure. This is my emotional style. This is the place where spirit has fused itself into my life, and ultimately we're all interconnected and interwoven in that way. So that's the model I used for what it means to be. Actually, there was another piece in here that I'm going to go back to, that what we are, human beings, we're a biopsychocosmic continuum. How's that? You want to put that in your pipe and smoke it? Biopsychocosmic continuum. That's the biopsychocosmic continuum. So that's what it means to be a living human being, is that we're biology and we're psyche, but we're also cosmos. And in death, each of those separate parts go through its own kind of journey of transformation.
I have so many more questions that I want to I'm also just remembering that I really do want to have you come to DC and do some longer workshops so we can have like a really deep time, not to kind of bypass. I mean, I think just there's so many things that come up for me around, like, do you personally believe in reincarnation? Do you personally believe in old souls versus younger souls, and like processing through wisdom?
When they asked my teacher, Reb Zalman, how long he believed in reincarnation, he said, oh, about 5 or 6 lifetimes. You know, when they asked Carl Jung, there's a wonderful interview with Jung, and the interviewer, it's 1959, and it's in black and white, and I don't remember the name of the interviewer right now. It'll come to me. He says, were you a religious family? Oh yes, we sort of went to church. Oh, you know, I can't emulate his accent so well. Did you believe in God? Oh, of course. Do you still believe in God? And he sort of steps back. He says, I don't believe, I know.
Yeah.
So, do I believe in reincarnation? I know that this being has been through other stories.
Yeah.
Because I've had those kind of experiences in lots of different ways. In fact, I for a while, at one point, I trained with Dr. Brian Weiss in doing past life therapy.
Yeah.
And so as part, some of those trainings
Yeah.
evoked some memories, and there were other moments of that.
Yeah.
So I definitely feel a soul in evolution through time and history. Yeah. I'll show you something else. I just created this for something I'm doing next week. You'll give me a second because I need to. Oh, here it is. I
And then
can tell it. What?
Nothing. I have another
I can
question.
tell the story. Okay, you see this starry sky?
No, can you share? It's not shared. Do I have to?
No, I have to do a screen share. Oh, okay. Are we up here now?
Yes.
So there I was 20 years old, and I was camping out along the Dead Sea. And I had never seen so many stars in my life. Plus, it was a different sky because I was in a different part of the planet. And I was talking to someone, and we were trying to figure out why there was no moon in the sky. And I wasn't so in touch with the Hebrew calendar, and because if I was, I would have known exactly where the moon was.
Yeah.
But we prided ourselves in the fact that it was the new moon, and there was no moon in the sky. And all of a sudden, around midnight, this moon began to arise in the sky. And all of a sudden, there was this incredible, radiant full moon. And I had this sense in that moment that I was like Abraham, standing under the stars on the same earth. And Abraham was called. God came to Abraham and said, look at the heavens and count all the stars, so shall your offspring be. And in that moment, I felt interwoven in time and history. Not only was I this Jewish kid from Montreal who was camping out at Ein Gedi, but I was like Abraham throughout the ages, being called. Abraham was called, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great. And we're all called in our own individual ways. So that was a very early experience.
Yeah.
And I had fun creating that graphically this week. That's that, right? But it was a moment like that I saw a certain sense of being part and parcel, not only of Jewish time and history, but as a solo human being on the planet. I went from my personal story to my cultural story to our planetary story. And I think that's what we're all doing. I think that's
Have
the
you
goal.
ever felt any fear of your path, or has it felt really clear? Has it just felt like a calling to open up death and the afterlife within the Jewish context and have these conversations and kind of pull forward Reb Zalman, your teachers, their work? Was
Well,
there
I
any
put a lot of therapists' kids through college doing therapy over the years to
Okay.
clear out all of the obstacles on the path.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
And as I get older, it feels like there's less of those in the way. Not that there's none.
Yeah.
So I think the path has always been there,
Yeah.
but there were years of struggling with the personality distortions that made it very difficult to get to the path.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I feel very blessed that I'm turning 70 in a couple of weeks, that those neuroses and addiction and lower unconscious challenges are not present in the same way. And that's why a lot of therapist kids got
Yeah.
to go to college, because I invested in them as I invested in myself.
Yeah.
So I think all rabbis and teachers and spiritual guides and therapists need to have their own guides and spiritual directors to help them claim their path. My spiritual director for many years was a nun, and she helped me a lot.
Um, I have to ask about trauma because it's so present right now, and the relationship, just kind of how you see, um, the let go and let God and the actual trauma in the body, and just anything on the relationship there. There's a lot of spiritual bypass in a lot of
Yeah.
communities, and trauma in the body, as we know, is, or maybe we know it's real or not real. I don't even know
No,
what.
no, no, it's very real. It's very real. It's
So
very real.
how do we kind of work with that?
Well, more and more there are people who can work with that.
Yeah.
More and more there are people who work with trauma, body awareness, healing of sexual abuse trauma. I mean, that,
Yeah.
that's very much part of my work. Besides doing grief work, I've also worked with sexual abuse survivors. And um, in the mid 1980s, which is a while ago, I was in a therapy group for men who had been sexually abused, and that was really
Mhm.
cutting edge when I go back, 1987, 88 or something like that. I had reason to do that, and did a lot of hard work and a lot of trauma work. And at a certain point in my own work, I realized I went from being a victim of sexual abuse to a survivor.
Mhm.
And the residue of that has dissipated. I don't have to serve at that altar anymore.
Mm.
My model for therapy and healing of abuse, that movie A Brilliant Mind, do you ever see that with Russell Crowe?
Mhm.
He's, for people who hadn't seen it, he's this little bit psychotic brilliant mathematician, and he keeps having all of these images of these little beings, these little children that sort of show up in his psychotic imagery. And then eventually he wins a Nobel Prize. And as he's on the way to walk up and receive the Nobel Prize, he sees a couple of these little psychotic images, and he says to them, "Not now. Now's not a good time." And I think that's successful therapy, where the etchings of woundedness, of trauma, they don't ever go away,
Mhm.
but we can say, you know what, I don't have to act that one out anymore.
Yeah.
I don't have to be the 4-year-old child who feels lost, or the 12-year-old boy who had blah 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 happen. I am living in a different address. Sometimes I say to my clients, where did you live as a child? And these days I could go to Google Maps,
Mhm.
or Google World,
Or, yeah.
Google Earth, and bring up an
Woo!
image of the apartment building a 75-year-old woman lived in when she was 15, living in Brooklyn, or because some of those
Yeah.
buildings are there. And I said, what's your current address? Are you living at 38 West, right? Or are you living at 1211, Maple Street? And I find that very, very helpful metaphor in working with people, because sometimes we're still living at the address where our trauma, where our abuse, where our early childhood experiences taking place, even though in our lives we have moved on way, way beyond that. And that's the difference between being the victim as opposed to the survivor. The victim is still living there. The survivor has moved on.
And it doesn't sound either like you're in the camp of sort of the modern Eckhart Tolle, like if it's just release and just be in consciousness and not.
Well, look, Eckhart Tolle
Ah,
says, don't stay in the pain body. I mean, in
yeah,
a way, release is good. Release is essential,
yes.
but we also have to recontextualize it. I believe, and I say this to my clients a lot, I believe in small victories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If today I don't do X, Y, and Z, which is my old habit pattern,
Mm-hmm.
that's a small victory.
Mm-hmm.
Tomorrow I might, but today I have a small victory. And maybe the next day I'll do something positive. So I encourage people to, there's the thou shalt nots and there's thou shalts. So it's avoiding the negative patterns and cultivating new behaviors.
Well, I just want to put it in context of like relationality, and that there's a lot of things within spiritual practices or afterlives or mediums or psychics that's very sexy to people right now,
Right.
or tarot or crystals. Like people are really invested in external, like luminosity, in order to say, like, if I just do that. And what I'm really curious about, and what I've been really studying and thinking about, is how do we have a relationship to the luminous and the human, the stuff that's happened in the human, and not get maybe too caught up in either. But I'm
Right.
just noticing extreme on either
Uh-huh.
end. We've got these talk therapists one-on-one, not addressing the body, just talk therapy, or not addressing the system, right? Systems theories. And it's just perpetuating this one-to-one, which is making a lot of people in our community, I think, kind of be questioning right now, why have I been in therapy for 10 years and I still feel like shit? And then you've got the other side, which I know a lot of people right now are like, I'm just, no responsibility for their actions or their activations,
Right.
just living in the luminosity of spirit. Everything is spirit, conversations with God always. I'm just going to have my own. So obviously, like, I'm a person of the middle path and the integrated path, and so I'm curious about kind of threading both, and it sounds like you're in a similar.
Well, I did my psychotherapy training internship in San Francisco in the late 70s, which was very interesting. It was an interesting time. We had you can get therapy there for $5 an hour, a session. And one day somebody came in a psychotic state, and he was in touch with a prophet from Jupiter. And the next day we had a class where one of our co-students did a meditation, and we got in touch with our guide from Venus.
I was going to say,
so it was hard to know who was crazy and who was not.
Yeah.
Right. But very early on, I found that when I worked with people who were also doing some kind of spiritual practice or body practice, somebody was training in massage therapy, or also doing some kind of other healing modality, they made much more progress in their therapeutic work. So it's not either or, but the extent that we can do, we can do both. Because what you're talking about is what they refer to sometimes as spiritual bypassing.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, somebody else I worked with in that era had some kind of mystical experience. He had been in AA, and AA produces sort of a higher power experience for some people. Having had a spiritual experience as a result of working these steps, right? So he came into therapy, and he was a recovering alcoholic, and it was like, I'm going to heal all alcoholics, and he was clearly in technical language, the ego was inflated with the energy of the self in the Jungian sense. And I said, that sounds very familiar to me. It's sort of your described experiences that I've read about people having mystical experiences. But how are you getting along with your roommates?
Correct. Yeah.
So that it was like that person needed to be grounded and need more grounding practices. So I'll sometimes say to people, what you need to do is walk for an hour around the block with your feet on the ground, breathing green, because that's grounding energy. And other people, I think you need to go out in the woods and cry your heart out to God.
Yeah.
So it's like knowing how to read where people are.
One of my yoga teachers used to always say, A.G. Mohan, he used to always say, please learn to stand on your feet before you stand on your head.
Right, that's right. Swami Satchidananda said, people think yoga is standing on your head, it's learning how to stand on your feet. That's right.
Yeah, because of that groundedness. But the headstand is so much sexier for online or kind of popular. Okay, last question, because that's all I want to take of your time before Shabbat. Okay, I have to name the elephant in the room, which are the blind spots of all the white male teachers and leaders you've named and studied with. Do you feel like there's voices missing? And even the conversations seem to, like, I guess my question is, okay, so there's these voices that are missing from a lot of this historical context and conversation. Right. Is there anything at your incredible wisdom and elderhood that you're like, oh, this is a blind spot we've had, or this part has been missing, or I'm curious to see how X will, explode the more we have women and teachers of color and therapists of color and spiritual teachers of color, like in more mainstream form, or authors even, anything you've been thinking of?
This is like let me throw you this last question that needs at least an hour and a half to even begin to have the conversation. Look, on one hand, I am, a white cisgender male, so not a blind spot. What are you talking about, right? On the other hand,
Rabbi, they put that in the.
It raises the question about whether Jews are white or other.
Oh, yeah.
Like that's a question I'm having with
conditional Judaism is what we call it. Yeah.
Right. Like sort of, in Israel, what a wasp is? It's a white Ashkenazi Sabra with protectia. But so I want to say, in terms of psychotherapy, there are other voices coming in. I mean, over the years, Gene Houston was a teacher of mine. Starhawk was a teacher of mine. There are, my wife, Rabbi Dr. Raphael, www. Shekhinah, just a few keystrokes you can get direct to the Shekhinah, are some of those voices that are really post-colonial in a certain kind of sense. So I think that that's the good news. And I'm originally Canadian.
Yeah.
So I was schooled in multiculturalism very early. The difference between the American experience, which was the golden age of the melting pot, the immigration philosophy of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, was we're all going to become great Americans. Whereas in Canada, because of the French English situation, Canada really saw itself and does as a cultural mosaic. So so as a young child, my parents would take me across town to see all of the Christmas decorations across Montreal. And I remember one Passover, we had the day off and we went to see some of the great churches of Montreal. And and my mother would tell me she would go to Christmas Eve mass as a child. So that stuff was much more comfortable for me.
Yeah.
And I have trouble with the ACLU not wanting not ALC, American Civil Liberties Union, not wanting the creche in the town square, because why not? There's a creche in the town square, and there's Jewish bakeries over here, and there's Greek restaurant. It was very much of a cultural mosaic. Even if that's true, there is still a kind of colonial white male bias that we're deconstructing.
Well, and that's what I mean. I don't mean to put you on the spot about sort of like race and our history and lineage. And it's very confusing with Judaism in terms of the time in history and where you live determines, is it white or not? In my experience, I pass with a lot of white privilege, but I can travel around the world and sort of blend in lots of different places. And that's just this experience. I think what I'm curious about is, when I read The Hero's Journey, I love frameworks, right? I love blueprints. I love pillars. I love development. I love like initiation. Oh, this is a pattern. I love patterns. That's why I love Ayurveda, because it's all about patterns. And then it helps me make sense of the chaos that I experienced the first 20 years. And so patterns and frameworks are really helpful. So when I read The Hero's Journey, I really tried to put myself into that and align and be within that. And I went to boarding school in high school. So in many ways, there's so many hero's journey stories where the kid goes to boarding school. So I kept trying to but it didn't even occur to me that the blind spot was still male patriarchal productivity, outcome, because I was so ingrained, so steeped in it. Right. Then I found things like Kohenet or the heroine's journey, the female journey, learning stories of going to the underground, learning the deeper, not just love and light up here that we had in sort of yoga and enlightenment, but like, what's it mean to go down and deep? And that's what I cannot wait as more of our experiences come and we start to reveal how asleep we've been to certain frameworks, that like what may happen as more of us are able to express different versions of the journey.
Yeah. Well, I studied with Jean Houston for three and a half years. And, her she would often say, we're living in this incredible time, a quickening of history and women's voices, and the collectivity of consciousness is clearly changing. Mm-hmm. So yes, I want to say yes to all of that. And there's still a lot of work to do, but sometimes I don't struggle on the other side of the paradigm. I just want to be, I just want to, I want to create it. But it's true. I mean, I pass for white in America. Actually, as a Canadian on a green card, I have no more rights in this country than Ahmad, the Pakistani taxi driver in New York. And I'm not inherently political, because if I went to a political demonstration and I got arrested, I could get deported. That's true. I tried a barbecue on the 4th of July and I couldn't, so I flunked my American citizenship. So I've been in this country for 30 years as an outsider. Yeah. So that's,
But you pass just to be clear.
I can pass as white privilege very easily. That's right. No, that's right. That's right.
I just want to clarify.
Very clearly. But it's interesting. It creates both an awareness and a certain conflict, a certain integrity.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah. I think, I understand that at a really deep level, because of, again, that sort of trauma piece that nobody can see on the outside, especially because I've been such a good student and I studied and I've done all the things to pretend that none of that really, has affected, but underneath those layers of of feeling separate are there. So it's something to continue to work through. What is the first thing that you want people to read? What's the intro book, or what's the video, or is there anything that you're like, okay,
Well, www.institute, DAAT
I'll link to it
institute.net
too. Yeah.
is my website. Da'at is an death awareness advocacy and training. It's also a Hebrew word for knowledge. And if people are like big readers, they can read Jewish Views of the Afterlife, but there's a lot of articles, there's YouTubes on there. I'm creating a resource base there. I've created that. So follow your dreams and write in your journal. And I think that's it for today.
Follow your dreams and write in your journal. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So you'll send